Okay. All right. Gerete, lemene, ne, I'm going to do the hard one. Melene, or tuono mamo ene Adrienne, as she said.
Yes.
For the rest of this talk, I will speak in English about code reviews, something that is very near and dear to my heart, something that should apply to all developers, no matter where you are in your career, or what language you are using, or what framework you are using. So let's go. Who here knows this emoji? Raise your hand. Who has seen this? Who has used this? Who has given this? Should be nearly everybody here, yeah? We should, right? We all know what this means. In the developer world, when we see this particular emoji, it stands for looks good to me. This concept that whenever we look at a code review, code changes that are about to be merged, code that needs to be reviewed, we typically use this phrase to say it's good. And if you're on one end of the spectrum, you like this emoji. You want to get your code review or your PR merged through, and you're looking for this. You want it as quickly as possible. You say yes, typically, when you get this. On the other hand, as you start to work a little bit more and you start to review a little bit more code, you start to have a love-hate relationship with this emoji, right? Yes, you still want your code review to be merged quickly. Other times you're like, I'm not supposed to be getting this quickly. Sometimes you prepare a careful PR and it's ready for someone to properly, thoroughly review, and they give you this emoji within 2 minutes. And you go, there's no way that you properly reviewed this in 2 minutes. And by the end, if you don't have any type of proper procedure in place, you learn to hate this emoji. So this is what I want to counter today. I want to tell all of us, remind all of us, what are we doing wrong? How do we fix those things? How do we go beyond just the bare minimum code reviews? And how this all relates to the DORA metrics that have been seen in a State of DevOps report. So what are we doing wrong? I'm sure as you're thinking about this, there are several parts of the code review that you're thinking about that you hate, that you dread. You don't like code reviews because of this particular thing. And I'm sure it's going to fall within any of these categories. We have to split this between the types of roles that are part of a code review. So we're going to look at this through the reviewer, and we're going to look at this through the author's perspective. And first, we're going to go through the reviewer. So the very first thing we do as code reviewers is that we do not leave our ego at the door. Sometimes when we're reviewing code, we think, oh, this is just a junior developer. I'm going to write as many comments as possible. Sometimes that's good, but typically the bad code reviews come from a place of, I know better, or this implementation is better, and you kind of just do the implementation that's correct without giving any reason why. Other times, you just think you can write more clever code, and that's not the case here. Other times, you focus on the developer rather than the code. So similar to what I said earlier, you tend to call out the developer. You say things that attack the developer. You don't focus on the code that's in the PR. You just simply focus on the developer too much. In a study that was done on detecting interpersonal conflict in issues and in code review, they are looking at open and closed source approaches. And when they looked at all of these code review comments, the funny finding that they found is that the use of second-person pronouns at the beginning of the sentence is more likely to be taken as impolite. So if your code review comment starts with you did this or you did that, the receiver, the author of the PR, is more likely to take that as a harsh or impolite comment. Now, skimming through reviews is another really, really bad thing that we do as reviewers. When we get really, really long reviews, changes that are 1,000 lines of code changed, or 50 files changed, or there's so many things there that it's almost impossible for any single human to look at this review properly, we're probably just going to go, looks good to me, right? The larger the PR, the more likely we're going to go, approve. And this is wrong as a reviewer. As a reviewer, we have an obligation, a responsibility to properly review the code, to give it the time that it needs, and to do what you need to do, whatever those goals are that are in your team, in the code review. See, the funny thing is, when we do pass through and we skim that review and we approve it and it merges, the thoughts typically that we have are, well, the developer has a bug in their code. Let's say this code was merged and a production issue has arisen. We think the developer has a bug in the code. It's their fault. But really, as a reviewer, we should be thinking, how did I miss that? Code that goes through a reviewer's purview is still our responsibility. It's not the developer's fault, or it's not the QA's fault that they didn't catch it during testing. We also have a responsibility to say we need to catch anything, if possible, when we give it a review. And one of the biggest things that we do wrong as a reviewer is we write ineffective comments. Ineffective comments are typically subjective, like return the result in an array instead, and that's it. What am I supposed to do with that information? Why do I need to return it in an array? What's not good about the current implementation? Tell me why. Ineffective comments are unclear. This could be better. That's it. So as an author receiving this comment, again, what am I going to do with a comment like this? Or they lack an outcome. I think there's something wrong here. What is it? Give me more of your thoughts. Think it out. Think it through yourself before you actually write the comment. Is there actually something here? Or are you going to leave me to do extra work to find out what it is that is wrong here? All of these things make the PR or make the code review much longer than it needs to be. So as a quick glance, these are all the things that we do wrong as a reviewer. We don't leave our ego at the door. We focus on the developer, not the code. We skim through reviews and let it go through very quickly. And we do not know how to write code review comments. Now, as an author, there are plenty of things we do wrong as well. It's not just the reviewer. So as an author, we are not our own first reviewer. There are so many things that could be caught if we just gave the due diligence as someone who is preparing their changes for a reviewer to view. We miss typos. We do not remove things that are unrelated to the PR, and we make the PR much larger because there's unrelated code changes in there. We don't add the context in the PR description. We have a really crappy title, and we don't know what it is that we're giving the reviewer to review. All of these things could be caught if we were just our own reviewer, but we don't. We don't use any automation during development. When I talk about automation, I talk about linting, formatting, static analysis, and testing. Who here has been through a code review and you start commenting or arguing about spacing and line breaks and formatting? Anybody? It's annoying, right? You go back and forth, nobody wins, someone's very opinionated. These are all of the things that should be caught during development. And even more, these are the things that you should agree with on your team in a team style guide so that they can be automated. So go 2 steps back, talk to your team, talk about what it is that you're going to abide by, what are your team rules for formatting, for linting, and then make automated rules for that so you can catch them during development. Same with static analysis and same with testing. Do as much as you can during development, fix all of those things during development because the robots are better at it anyway. You don't want to be talking about this during the code review. You want to take all of that noise out and you want to focus on the things that really matter in a code review, not some spacing issue or a comma. And one of the biggest things that we do wrong is making our PRs unmanageable. Who agrees with this tweet? We should all be raising our hands if you're in this talk. Yeah? It's true. When we make our PRs unmanageable, which could be many lines of code, which could be many files to check, we do not set the reviewer up for success. We set them up to either skim the review or we set them up so that they don't actually catch potential defects or give it time to properly review it. Making your PRs unmanageable as an author means there's too many files. Changes aren't atomic. You have unrelated changes, you have config file changes, you have random version bumps, all stuffed together in a single PR, and now the reviewer has to take that all in context. Sometimes, if you have a really large feature, you have multiple parts of a large feature that are in a single PR. So these are all things that really make our PRs unmanageable. They make them unruly for someone to review and make it more likely for them not to give it a proper review. And we treat our PRs as a burden. I don't know if you have ever seen PRs, but there are several PRs at several jobs that I've worked at where this is the PR. There's no description, there's no linked work items, there's no labels, bug fix is the title. Bug fix for what? You're left leaving much to the imagination. You do not set the reviewer up for success, and you don't get any of that information out from your head as an author into the PR. Finally, we tie our worth to our code. So as authors, as software developers, we sometimes really feel like our code is an extension of us. So whenever we receive feedback, even if it's constructive feedback, we think, why are you even writing anything about this? This is perfect. This is my baby. This is something I took a lot of time and care into writing. And so sometimes whenever we receive any type of feedback, we feel like we are not a good developer, or we feel like we're stupid, or we feel like we didn't do it the right way the first time. These are all thoughts that we need to separate. We need to have, funnily enough, speakers were talking about separation of concerns as something mentioned in every talk. We need to separate those concerns. We do not need to think we are our code. So as an author, we are not our own first reviewer. We make our PRs unmanageable. We don't use any automation during development. We treat PRs as a burden, and we tie our worth to our code. All the things we're doing wrong as an author. So how do we fix all of those things? That's why you're here, right? Let's start with the reviewer. Very simple, forget your ego. Focus on the code. Focus on the code, not the developer. Those are two things that should be more inherent in the team. It should be part of the culture, and it should be something that we strive for as professional software developers to do code reviews in this way. In that same paper where we were detecting interpersonal conflict, one of the other findings that we found is that we see many software engineering-related engrams, so words within the comments. And among the non-toxic comments, they always found words that were more technical, words that were related to the code or the actual feature. So the pull request or the function or something about the code, never about the developer. And when they were grading toxic comments, there was usually a mention of the person, the developer. So toxic comments usually have mention of the developer. Non-toxic comments usually focused on the code. Now, when you write a comment as a reviewer, you should ask yourself, do you mention the person a bit more than the code? Is the overall feeling combative, commanding, or do you have passive-aggressive undertones? Does the comment add value? Does it actually bring productive discussion to this code review? And can any parts of your comment be lost in translation, misconstrued, or not apply? And then finally, does the comment contribute to the overall developer happiness? These are all things we kind of inherently know. We think it's common sense, but sometimes it's not common sense. That's why we still dread code reviews. That's why we still have a difficult time writing comments that will be accepted or be effective for the author. Proper, thorough reviews are another thing that we need to do as a reviewer. There are some studies that have been found that give rough guidelines. So they say to review code in 25 to 45-minute focus bursts. So with the help of having PRs that are actually small enough to review in that amount of time, as a reviewer, in order to give it a proper review, this is the suggested amount of time. Anything past 45 minutes, our focus starts to drain away. We start getting more likely to be distracted. We don't have that serious focus on the code. So they suggest between 25 to 45 minutes. Don't be afraid to also send back PRs that are too large to review. Sometimes we take on that burden from an author who isn't doing their part of the code review, and so we just kind of go through and toil through these really, really large PRs. But if it is too large, send it back to the author. Say, this is way too much for me to review. Take out all the unnecessary stuff. Make sure it's only the change that I really need to focus on so that I can properly review it. Not to mention, if something does go wrong, you can easily revert that back and you can pinpoint it much better if the changes are much smaller. And then do what's necessary to obtain the full context of the code changes. So sometimes when we're talking to the author, we go back and forth online. We write a comment here, we write a comment there, keeps going back and forth. And sometimes you just need to take that discussion offline. If you are lucky enough to be in person, although I don't know if anyone wants to be in person, but if you're able to just, give a tap on the shoulder to your coworker and talk it out that way, that can resolve a lot of questions and make it much less long in the code review if you can. Otherwise, try to schedule a really quick video call, talk through the changes in your code review, and do it that way rather than going back and forth in the comments. And then writing effective comments. So to me, effective comments are objective, they're as specific as possible, and they have a focused outcome. Because we need to be objective, right? We need to focus on the code, we do not focus on the developer. So how do you write an objective comment? You suggest with facts, and before asking for a change, ask yourself, why are you going to ask that person to make a change? Because when you think about it in your own head, let's say you're going to ask someone to refactor something. Ask yourself, why did you come up with that thought? Because that does two things. First, you can really think out if this is really necessary. And two, if you're clearer yourself, you're going to be able to better write the comment in a clear way to the author, explaining yourself, suggesting with facts, giving exactly the context and detail why you were wanting that change. If you don't do that and you just kind of suggest the change, that's where you get the comments that are kind of unclear or are very, very hard to understand from the author. And then, of course, target the code as presented to you. As reviewers, we also need to be very, very specific. The more specific, the better. Be clear if something needs to be done. So who here uses nitpicks in their comments, or who knows what nitpicks are? Raise your hand. Okay, I see a few. So nitpicks are, for whatever reason, they're purely subjective, meaning if a reviewer leaves a nitpick comment, it's labeled as a nitpick, and then the nitpick, it's something that the author just does not need to do anything with, but the reviewer felt it was necessary to really write that out. So again, these are more for preferential things. Typically, they're assigned to styling issues like nitpick. I really wish there was a line break in between the first variable declaration and logic. These are nitpicks. They don't actually have to take any action onto it. But we can do this with the other kinds of changes if something actually does have to be done. So for example, if you have a comment where you're actually asking for a change, label it right in the beginning, needs change, and then put your comment. That way, when an author looks through and sees all of their comments, they can immediately mentally say, oh, there's a change that needs to be done here. If it needs to be reworked, tell them that. Have them mentally prepare that there's going to be more rework that needs to be done, larger changes that needs to be worked on or typically discussed. And then nitpick. These are purely subjective commentary, but for whatever reason, some teams might put them or use them. Pinpoint exactly what you're talking about. So most code review tools already do this. So only highlight the relevant code that you're discussing. Sometimes when I get a code review comment, it's highlighting like the entire page. And I'm like, what do you want me to do here? What is exactly that you want? Only highlight the code that you're discussing. If you can, explicitly call out the method or the variable or the class that you are referencing. And if necessary, call out the line numbers to be even more specific. Sometimes if you can't use the highlighting tool in, say, GitHub or some other kind of code review tool, and it doesn't exactly pinpoint what you want to highlight, then you can write that out in the comment. Hey, the logic here between lines 24 and 27 are really hard for me to follow. Being more specific means less time for your author to figure out what it is that you want. And then as reviewers, we need to provide a focused outcome. So in another study on code review comments where they were looking at the language, an interesting finding was that apparently the most useful comments were those that contained some sort of verbs that were about transformation. So in this paper, they looked at a bunch of comments and they said these were rated useful comments and then these were rated non-useful comments. And then those that had transformation, so refactor, rename, move, delete, anything that changes the state of code was more likely to be marked as a useful comment. And so we can take that finding, and when I developed this thing called the triple R pattern, so it's the pattern. And what you can do when you are writing a comment to make it have a focused outcome is have a request, have a rationale, and have a result. You have a request, a sentence explaining what it is that you want the author to do. You have the rationale, you have a sentence or two explaining what it is that the request is for, and any references or links pretty much supporting what it is you're asking the author to change, and then a result. That could be something measurable that the author can use. It could be a screenshot of what it is exactly that you want it to look like. If it's performance optimization, it could be a metric that they need to hit. Be as specific as possible if you can, so that when the author knows that they've made this change, they can actually compare it to the result that you've given. So as an example, if you wanted to say you wanted to move a method, this is what, as a reviewer, you're asking the author to do. With this pattern, your request could be, please move the authenticate user method into our authentication utilities library. Rationale, we have similar methods like this one and this one, and they are in there for a few more times, which warrants its place in the library. Also, our team working agreement, our set of guidelines that the team agrees upon, tells us that we need to put these kinds of behavior within the authentication utilities library. So these are all of your reasons for why you're asking for the method to be moved. And then the result, after this change, calls to the authenticate user method should go through the library rather than the standalone declaration. So request, rationale, response, or result, sorry. Same thing when you have a really, really long PR, right? You can use this method as well. Let's say somebody has sorting behavior and filtering behavior, and that's a lot of code, and it makes the PR really, really long. You can use this again to ask them to split it, create a separate PR. Request, could you separate the sorting behavior into its own PR? Rationale, I'm having trouble reviewing both. There's too much stuff with both the filtering and the sorting. Plus, if something goes wrong, we can't pinpoint it to one specific thing. We want to target a single feature per PR. Result, filtering behavior and sorting behavior are separated, and they're isolated into their own respective PRs. You can be even more helpful. You can give them links to Git cherry pick if you want to help tell them how to do the splitting of the feature. You can be as helpful as you want, but having this kind of pattern enables you to get your thoughts clear, and then also helps the author be very, very clear on what they need to do. And another example, request a meaningful variable name. So please rename the variable item to something more or something less ambiguous. Rationale, it's way too vague. Result, the meaningful name should be this. So these are all the things that we should be doing, right? Forget your ego, focus on the code, not the developer, go through proper, thorough reviews, and write effective comments. As an author, we have a lot of things that we need to do as well. So be your own first reviewer before you put your PR up to be submitted. If you have PR draft states, that's an excellent way for you to kind of check your stuff and be your own first reviewer. But as an author, Be your own first reviewer. Make sure the title is there. Make sure you have linked items. Make a checklist. This is something a team can do, or use PR templates so that whenever you open a PR, you have a checklist that you can go through so that you are reminded of everything that should be there to have a proper PR. Make PRs manageable. So what are manageable PRs? Because that can be very, very subjective. Based on what we've talked about and how they are not manageable, we can focus on an atomic change or a feature. Make it as small as possible, because the smaller the feature, the smaller the resulting PR. Include only what's necessary for the code changes to work. Again, get rid of unrelated changes, get rid of your console logs, which again is something that can be taken out with a linter and a formatter, linter really with rules. Make sure only what is necessary for the change to work is in the actual PR. Split multiple parts into multiple reviews. So if you have actual relevant changes, but they're too long, try to split it into the more appropriate singular parts. These are likely able to be reviewed in 10 to 20 minutes, or really the 45-minute max that we set on the reviewer to review code. That's more like reviewing code for multiple PRs. But when you are talking about your own PR, try to see if you can make it that small that it can be reviewed within 10 to 20 minutes. This is also really good because people who complain and say, oh, code reviews take too long, it takes too much time away from me, I don't have time to do it. If your PR is small enough that it only takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes, then that context switch is not as bad as a PR that takes an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours to review. So the smaller the PR, basically, the better. In another study by Dragan Stepanovic, he found that typically under 500 lines of code tend to have the best engagement, meaning reviewers are able to give more proper reviews, they're more able to catch actual things that need to be brought up, and they're able to see higher stakes issues if the code is less than 500 lines. And then based on another study by Microsoft, where they took a look at code reviews, they are typically less than 20 files changed. So these are just rough guidelines that shows you how to make your PRs a bit more manageable. Let the robots take over during development. So again, if you're not using any kind of linting, formatting, static analysis, or unit tests, any automated tests that you can run, try to introduce those into your workflow. Try to come up with your team style guide as a team, and then start implementing those rules. Because the more that you catch during development and the more that you can fix during development, the more you can take those away from the code review, and the more the reviewer can focus on the more meaningful things to look at in the code review. Prime your PRs. It is your job. So when I say prime your PRs, there's a quote that comes to mind. It's, when one is writing a letter, he should think that the recipient will make it into a hanging scroll. This is from Hagakure, the Book of the Samurai, from Yamamoto Tsunetomo. And what this means is that when you write your PR, if you come back to it 6 months from now, 12 months from now, if a new person starts on your team and looks at this PR, if you have a bug and you need to reference what happened or what changes occurred, your PR should be so descriptive that you know exactly why this PR was made. So title should be very descriptive. What is the title? And I need to know what exactly the change is. The description shouldn't be what is happening, because that's what the code diff shows. The description should be the context. We had this discussion that led to this change. We had a library deprecate, which led to this change. What are the reasons behind why you are submitting this PR in the first place? Context, context, context. Add labels, add your linked work items. The more that you can make this that hanging scroll, the more you can make this that descriptive PR, the better it is for everybody on your team, and the better it is for this code review to give you that other benefit, which is giving you a historical artifact that you can look back on in the future. And remind yourself, you are not your code. No matter how much you feel, you can feel clever, you can feel like you've solved the problem really well, believe in you and your skills, but you are not your code. Remember to not tie yourself to your code and feel bad about yourself if you do happen to get constructive feedback on your code from a reviewer. So be your own first reviewer. Make your PRs manageable, meaning make them as small and as atomic as possible. Let the robots take over, do linting, formatting, static analysis, unit tests, take away as much of the fluff as possible during development so that the code reviews can be proper. Prime your PRs, make them really, really context-filled and make them so that they read like a historical artifact for your team. And remind yourself that you are not your code. So that's just bare minimum, right? Who here agrees with me that if we actually did all of this, that our code reviews would improve immediately, even just one thing? Yeah. For me, I think that is bare minimum. The fact that you go through a code review, all those things should be in place so that code reviews can be as effective as possible. But if you want to go beyond that, if you want to make them really, really good, then I have some other things that you can consider. So I referenced this earlier, but that is to create a team working agreement. This is a document that basically your whole team writes out all of the expectations you have for how you work on your team. So for example, with a code review, sometimes it's implicit. You don't know, do we need 2 reviewers or do we only need 1 reviewer? Can you approve your own code? Can only the same person approve the code? Who is allowed to approve code? All of these things, these rules and these policies that you have about how software development works in your team should be discussed and then put in this team working agreement. Your style guide goes in here, your coding conventions go in here, how you deal with each other goes in here, what happens if you have an emergency production hotfix that needs to go through. Are you allowed to skip your code review? Can you just merge it straight to production to do the hotfix? These are all the things that we kind of implicitly think we know as a team, but until they happen, we don't. And then even worse, sometimes different team members have different opinions on that. So having something like a team working agreement can put all of those expectations out onto paper, more explicit, and help the whole team be on the same page for how you work. If possible, use PR templates. So like I mentioned, depending on GitHub has this, where let's say you're opening a bug fix or a new feature, you can have a different template that says, here's the checklist items that you need if it's a new feature, here are the different checklist items you need if it is a bug fix. This can help your author be PR primed. It can remind them everything that they need to put in the PR and make sure that those PRs are actually more context-filled and just not empty. If possible, auto-assign reviewers. Who here has heard of the code owners file on GitHub? Awesome, okay. So code owners file is a really neat file on GitHub. I believe other code review tools have ownership policies like this too, but it's a file where you can say, for all, let's say, files that have a JS extension, a JavaScript file extension, auto-assign any PRs that have a JavaScript file change to this person. That means that if you know who is the best person to review specific code, you know, somebody is way more advanced in TypeScript or someone knows way more about legacy code, you can automatically have those people assigned when that particular part of your code base changes. So this can kind of help remove bias, and it can also mean that new people or people who are unsure of who to ask to review the code can just be auto-assigned instead, and you know that you're getting the right person and the best person to review that code. Now, on the other side of that, there's something called informational reviewers. So a lot of people say there's a really, really small pool of people who can actually approve reviews or review and actually approve, get the approving mechanism. Sometimes that's only senior developers. Other times it's people who have worked on the team for at least 6 months. There's all kinds of different rules for different teams. And sometimes that means the number of people who can approve gets really, really small. So something that you can play with is something called informational reviewers. This is where you ask someone to actually look at the code, and they don't necessarily have to approve, but they get that knowledge transfer. And this is an excellent way for you to level up your entire team. Whether it's someone new that joins the team, doesn't matter if they're junior or senior, they're just getting used to your code base, they can be part of the major changes that are changing, and they can see what is being changed, even though they don't actually have to review. But this is also good for junior developers or those who are new to programming, because then they can see what are the changes that are being made, what's the context behind the change. If there's discussion on it, they can also be part of that discussion and say, oh, these are the considerations that are happening when code is reviewed. This is how we do things on our code base. So informational reviewers are a great way to have more people get knowledge transfer on your code base. And then finally, code compliments are encouraged, but within reason. So we think about code reviews and we think about this as a very negative process, right? It's everything that you did wrong in this review or everything that's being judged by the code that we have written. But sometimes, and especially if you see something really, really neat or really novel or a cool way someone has actually solved a problem, say so. It doesn't have to always be negative. I say within reason because don't take this as every time you see something cool, you add a little reaction, you add a little emoji, and this can become the other problem where it's littered with so many comments that, again, it's really, really hard to see what actually matters. So leave this to something that's really, really neat, really novel. Sometimes they've done a really neat performance optimization, or everyone was having a really hard time solving a problem, and then someone actually opened a PR that actually fixed the problem. Those are the kinds of things that should warrant a code compliment. And so now we get to code reviews and DORA metrics. Who here has heard of the DORA metrics? Okay, quite a few people. The DORA metrics, really, this is the report that is making everybody upset right now in software development. It's a Google, and the DORA organization, and they studied a lot of companies, and they said, here are some metrics. They developed some metrics that said, you're an excellent company, you're an excellent software development team, the way your engineering processes are like excellent or terrible. And so, particularly, it's these metrics that everyone's up crying about. It's basically deployment frequency, how often do you deploy to production, lead time for changes, which is how long from code commit to code in production, time to restore service, how quickly can you fix a production fire, and then change failure rate, what percentage of your deployed changes actually cause production fires. So if you take a look, before they actually had ratings of elite, which are like the best rating, elite teams, and then you had high, medium, and low. This time when they did the report, they actually removed elite because there was not too many distinguishing factors between elite and high, so high was the highest you can earn. And if you look at how they rate these teams, you basically want to be on the high end of everything. So deployment frequency, you want to deploy as frequently as possible. Lead time for changes, you want that to be very quick, between a day and 1 week. Time to restore a production fire, you obviously want that to be as fast as possible. High teams earn less than 1 in a day. And then change failure rate, obviously you want a very low percentage of deployed changes to cause production fires. So this has been debated, this has been talked about, but the only thing I will leave you here with everything that we've learned today and everything that we know we can do to make code reviews better, the one thing I will tell you about this is don't let these metrics convince you to cut corners on code reviews, because that is how some of these metrics are being used, particularly for deployment frequency. If teams are so focused on just this single metric and they say, oh, we need to get a really good metric and get a really good rating on that, one of the first things people do is say, let's cut code reviews, or let's kind of cut corners and not make it so thorough, not make it so proper, so that we can up these metrics. But that is the wrong thing to do, and that is the wrong way to use these metrics, incentivize them for the wrong way. I'll tell you that if you do the things that we've talked about today, make those PRs smaller and actually review the code properly as a reviewer and work together to make these things better, then you can actually have more meaningful, more effective code reviews that are are actually great and that you will want to do. So, Sas Evcharisto, Voxxed Thessaloniki, that is code reviews. So that's like a smattering of stuff about code reviews. I'm actually writing a book on it. And if you like this talk, I highly encourage you to just check out my book. It's currently in early access on Manning, and you can help make it better. If you want to have your own story or have your own things that say, no, that's wrong, we don't do that way, Adrienne, then you can actually leave feedback in the book forum as I write it, and I will see it. So I highly encourage you to check it out if you do like it. So, σας ευχαριστώ.
Εμείς ευχαριστούμε, Adrienne. Do we have any questions, ερωτήσεις? Πάμε εδώ πρώτα.
Hello. I would like to ask and focus on, as an author, you said that we should keep code reviews, and I agree, small. But there are times that we need to write a feature that indeed is really large, right? And it has multiple files, and probably we need then to make a single PR out of it. So in the history is a single PR. How do we deal with this? How can we cut it into smaller PRs so it's easy to review? Thank you.
Great question. So yes, sometimes there are code reviews that just warrant a lot of files. The exception to the file rule, which I said they're rough guidelines, right? But sometimes there's these reasons. Let's say you are refactoring and you're renaming a variable. Sometimes that is a very common reason to have like 60, 70, 100 files change, but it's a very focused topic that you're looking at. So in the review, even though it is 60, 70, 100 files, you know that the only thing that you're checking for is that the thing has been renamed. So again, that's an atomic thing that you are reviewing, and that kind of is an exception to the rule. Another thing to look at is, let's say you do have a feature and it is really, really large, and the way that you have written it has multiple files. The thing you want to do there is you actually want to take a step back into your design and your planning process. Why did the feature get so large? What was the scope creep that may have happened that made this feature so big? In the middle of the feature, as you're developing it, were there things that were added? Were there things that were not caught? These are common reasons that the feature just grows so exponentially large. So that's one thing to look at, is in your planning and designing phase, does the thing really need that much stuff to do? And is it really supposed to be in a single task or a single story? If not, if you can separate it there, then that's one way that you can kind of assure that the resulting PRs are going to be smaller as well. So that's another way that you can hopefully minimize and make those smaller. Now, the last part is if you just have a feature and it's large, the one thing you can do is have a multiple part PR that is split. So this is where it might be more hand-holding. Maybe you want to do a pair programming session that says, okay, we're about to review and merge a really large feature. We need the whole team on deck on here. So you go through and you actually, as a team, split the feature into manageable chunks that you all understand. And then you go through those PRs one by one. And honestly, if it is a feature that is that large and that integral to the code base, then you would want the whole team to be a part of that. So that is another way to cut those code changes into a more manageable way in the PR.
Nice. Did we have a question here? Yeah.
Do you see this clear connection between the how big your team is and which amount of time you need to spend on different types of reviews and maybe additional calls, additional meetings? And if yes, then what's the amount of how big is team? How big team should be not to become a total burden for you to spend so much time on reviews?
If I understand your question correctly, depending on the team size, how can you manage how long? Okay, so A really common thing is that there are small teams. Typically, there's like 5 or 6 people. There's a single senior developer. And what's very common, I call it the single senior developer as a bottleneck, reviewer bottleneck problem, is that it's only them who has the experience to review the code. So they are the ones who are assigned to every PR. And that means it's going to be a bottleneck. Only one person going through all of the team's code can be daunting and will be a loophole in there, or a bottleneck. So in a small team, something like the informational reviewers is something to start with. The one thing you need to do is you need to level up everyone's knowledge slowly. That's the only way to remove the bottleneck of a single person if the problem is too few people. If you have a larger team, the pool of reviewers are not so much a problem, but what you can start making use of are the code owner's file, or targeting specific sub-teams or experiences on the reviewer pool set. So the more that you can have subsets of teams, like let's say a front-end team and a back-end team and then a full stack team, then you can kind of split where the pull requests go, and then you can kind of split the time out that way. That, paired with all the things to make pull requests smaller, should be beneficial to any team. But that is a major problem on smaller teams, is that there's typically one person that's the bottleneck, and so you need to level up the whole team. The other part of that is that whenever you do assign code reviews to someone, a lot of people go, I don't know anything about this code, so I can't review it. When are they ever going to know? It's going to continue, right? So if they are actually a part of your team, and they are probably going to deal with that code at some point, or inherit that code at some point, or integrate with that code at some point, don't let that be an excuse. Have them at least start out as an informational reviewer, or this is now the time that you're going to get familiar with that code. So.
Great answer. Karistuma.